Welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. Today, our honored guest is Professor Richard Landis, who is a leading historian of Jewish medieval history. He taught at Boston University and now lives and works in Jerusalem. He is the author of many books on the topic, including Heaven and Earth, the Varieties of Millennial Experience, and Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and Global Jihad. You can purchase these books on Amazon, and for your convenience, we appended links to them below this video. We invited Professor Landis to answer two our questions on the issue of ideological and religious supersessionism, or as some people call it, teaching of contempt, in Christian, Muslim, and Marxist tradition, as well as now among large share of neo-pagan climate activists, and its use as a clay that binds the enemies of Israel and Jewish people together. Our second question is how reliable American Christian support for Israel today, given that the Catholic Church recently, as Pope did, is moving toward its centuries-long position of hostility toward the Jewish people, something that seemed to have been changed after 1962. Richard, thank you for stopping by and welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe.
Thank you.
So let's start with the first question. I saw a number of your presentations on supersessionism, and to my mind, they were very, very good. And the latest one I saw was the attitude of Marxist or the leftist, and I want you to explain it to me, how this supersessionism, which normally related only to two daughter religions, that is Christianity and Islam, has migrated and became an integral part of the leftist ideologies.
Yeah. So my daughter's saying goodbye to me.
This is the best person there.
Look, there are different ways to look at the problem. And, the way you framed it is interesting, because I would argue that Marxism and the Enlightenment and even postmodernism are daughter religions of Judaism, just like Christianity and Islam are.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah,
continue.
Yeah. And as a result, you have in all of them this psychological problem. I forget who wrote it, but somebody, it was Harold Bloom, wrote a book called The Anxiety of Influence. And it's about the way in which people want to appear original. And they're very anxious about the possibility that they have been influenced by other people. And in that sense, you've got, and that's why it's even more disguised in Marxism and the Enlightenment and subsequent examples. Christianity and Islam Christianity is completely open about deriving from Judaism. Islam is less so. They have a narrative in which, the Jews corrupted scripture and so on and so forth. But, they're the Quran and the Hadith and are shot full, and the histories are shot full of Jewish midrash and various elements. There's the Joseph story in the Quran and so on. So they're clearly related to Judaism, but the Enlightenment really tried to cover its tracks, and so did Marx, who insisted that he was purely scientific. But what's interesting about all of them is that they have this psychological problem with acknowledging the origin. And so what they do is they they have a sort of instinctual need to believe that their truth is the ultimate truth, which is why Islam says that Muhammad is the last prophet. There can't be another prophet after him. At the time, he thought he was the prophet before the last judgment. So he would be the last prophet because he was the prophet of the last judgment. When the last judgment didn't come, they switched to saying that he was the last prophet. But in any case, what you have in all of these cases is a belief system that holds itself to be the true one that's really going to liberate everyone, and that there's a kind of vested interest in believing that they have surpassed and replaced Judaism, which is, too particularistic, too nationalistic, too confined, but they are universalistic and therefore superior. And with that, you have what I call triumphalist religiosity, which is the belief that your religion is true because it holds the primary place of honor in the society in which it finds itself. So, for instance, in Islam and in medieval and early modern Christianity, Muslims and Christians have preference before the law. They have status before the law that infidels do not have. So, for instance, in Islam, a Jew or a Christian cannot bear witness, which sort of cripples you if you're trying to work in the society. And it's intended to do that. Now, with the later groups, you have, on the one hand, this vilification. On the other hand, it's a kind of it's a need to see Jews as it's important to believe that Jews are inferior to you. That's sort of built into the identity of supersessionism. And as a result, what you have, and this is how I first realized that it was alive and well in the 21st century, was I was working on the way the media covers the Arab-Israeli conflict. And after a while, I just became convinced that there's such a desire, such a taste, a thirst for news of Jews behaving badly. And as I thought about it, I thought, this is the supersessionist impulse. In other words, I feel better about myself because I can look down on you. And that's what you had starting in 2000 with the outbreak of the Intifada and stuff. And, repeatedly people like, from the UN would say Israel's lost the moral high ground. And they didn't mean they lost the moral high ground to the Palestinians who were engaged in a suicide terror war on Israeli civilians. What they believed they had lost the moral high ground to was themselves, was the left. And the left was no longer, after the Holocaust, beholden to the Jews. They didn't have to, sort of apologize to the Jews for having done them bad. And you end up with a situation in which there's a sort of insatiable appetite that makes you feel good about yourself, because you get to look down on your rival. So that's my psychological reading of what drives this supersessionist impulse. And it's a profoundly zero-sum one. I mean, starting with Christianity, it wasn't the Christians didn't say, we too are chosen. They said, no, we're chosen instead of you. You've been unchosen. God doesn't like you anymore. He likes us. So it's, there's an infantile, daddy likes me best quality to it, which I think is certainly visible in Islam. Now, not so visible in the secular versions like the Enlightenment or Marxism or postmodernism, where they wouldn't say God likes me better. But, in a sense, they're saying, I like me better.
Well, not only I like me better, but history is on my
Yes,
side,
yes, yes.
and
So
a
for Marx,
symptom.
it was history instead of God.
What is it?
For Marx, it was history rather than God that drove
Right.
the dialectic.
Well, for most of the people in politics, it's also history, some other thing, not only for Marx. But for
Yeah.
Marx, it was also that the presence or disappearance of Jews is the crucial hallmarks of a social progress.
Yes, yes. So the Jews become, I mean, David Nierenberg wrote a very good book on this, on anti-Judaism. One of the things he showed was that people would literally define themselves as good because the Jews were bad. The Jews do this, but I do something better or the opposite. And in many cases, as in the Enlightenment, they're just secularizing Jewish values.
Mm. So, but still, I'm trying to get the answer for the first question.
Right.
Now, the way I see it, supersessionism is a form of negation.
Yes, it's a form of it's an identity, it's an invidious identity formation. In other words, I identify as the superior, and therefore you must play the role of the inferior.
And whenever somebody negates something, he, without wanting to, immediately makes himself to be an offspring of the item
Right,
or people that he negates.
right. He's basically made
Although he
his
says that I
identity
have nothing to do with you, you are nothing,
right.
etc.
Right. No, but what he's done, in fact, or she has done, is to make their identity dependent
Mm.
on not just another, but another who is down. So if the Jews go up, as they did during, the period when the Enlightenment was put into practice, the French revolutionaries and even the American revolutionaries thought, okay, we'll do a favor to the Jews, we'll let them participate in our society on an equal basis. But as soon as that happened, the Jews who have been practicing the basic principles of meritocracy and equality before the law for millennia rise to the top. And that makes people anxious. And Israel is the sort of embodiment of the success of Jews, especially if you look at the neighborhood we're in. If it weren't for oil, the entire Arab world would be below the poverty line. Palestine was below the poverty line before the Zionists came. And, we've turned it into a powerhouse. And that clearly makes people very anxious. And then when we start defending ourselves and we actually kill people, that terrifies them.
Yeah. So, continuing on this question, because one of the things I see that to me is amazing is the leftists or supposedly leftists, whatever they are,
Right.
Marxists,
Progressives in quotes.
progressives, anti-racist, and things like they stand uh, together with people who shown themselves to bring not democracy, not
Right.
freedom, not human rights, but oppressive societies
Right.
where not only I do not mean women or minorities or blacks
Right.
oppressed, where they themselves are oppressed by other
Right.
castes within their societies.
Right. By their elites. Exactly.
So um, the way I see it, the leftist sympathy with the Arab Muslims, first of all, who are frontline, and or as they call,
Right.
those that decide to call themselves Palestinian,
Right.
the leftists in the West. But by the way, in one of your talks, you
Right.
mentioned that the first massive demonstration in Europe
Right.
took place on October 6th, I think 2000.
2000.
Yeah,
2000. It was about Muhammad Abdullah. Yeah.
right. The object of your book and
Right.
things like that. Now, is it coincidence that October 6, 2000 and October 7, 2023?
Yeah, I think so.
Just simply coincidence. Okay.
I think it's coincidence. And by the way, my entire career as a medievalist is based on observing dates that are not coincidences. Like, for instance, Charlemagne is crowned on the first day of the year 6000, according
I'm
to
sorry,
the
you
Christian
broke up.
chronology
Wait,
that was
I'm sorry,
dominant throughout the early Middle Ages.
Richard. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This problem was the. Could you please repeat it because you broke up there? You know the sound.
Yes. Okay. So my career in medieval history is seeing dates that are not coincidences. For example, Charlemagne is crowned emperor on the first day of the year 6000, according to a count that Christians followed throughout the early Middle Ages. So, but by the time he was crowned, they had switched to Anno Domini, and nobody mentioned that it was 6000. And historians say, oh, that's just coincidence. But I do think October 6th and October 7th are coincidences.
Coincidence. Well,
Yeah.
okay. So because I was thinking that maybe they love October in order to.
Well, certainly, they like October because it's the Jewish holidays, the high holidays. So, for example, Muhammad Abdullah was done on September 30th. So a week later, the following Saturday was the demonstration, but September 30th was the beginning of a 3-day holiday for the Israelis, which meant that nobody would get around to responding to it for 3 days. And in those 3 days, it just took like wildfire. So, also the October War, the Yom Kippur War, and October 6th was picked because it was Shavuot. So, yeah, if there's a reason why they pick October, it's because they like to attack us on our holidays.
The thing also within this context, I'd like to ask, and this is the transition to my second question,
Okay.
and that is in your you are one of the major scholars of millennialism.
Right.
That is thousand years, thousand years, thousand years, and you wrote, and I first of all, everything that I read written by you, I really
Yeah.
like a lot. Uh,
Thank you.
so, and you wrote that until 1010, that is the 10th year of the second
New
millennium of
millennium.
Christian
Right.
era,
Right.
Jews in what we should be calling Ashkenaz, that
Right.
is southern France, western Germany, northern Italy. By the way, uh, to my mind, this is absolutely a proper name for this because it originated from Gothics, Goths that were moved there from the Italy when Justinian, kicked them out, and Jews who were their major allies in Italy at that time moved
Okay.
along, many of them moved along with them.
Right.
So for a long time, Jews enjoyed peaceful coexistence in that part of the world. But then
Well,
something
let's put
happened.
it this way. In comparison with subsequent times, yes. I wouldn't make it too idyllic, but yeah, I mean, we have evidence that in most conditions, and until some bishop decided that the Jews had to be attacked, by and large, the default attitude was to treat the Jews as a nation, like any other nation, have them run their affairs by their laws, and basically interact on a relatively equal uh, relationship with the other peoples that populated Europe at the time. But in 1010, you have the first serious and I think extremely serious massacres of Jews, which will then be repeated in 1096 during the Crusade, 85 years later, 86 years later, and then becomes a regular feature of European society until the post-war period with the Nazis. And now we're looking at the resurgence of this hostility. Yeah,
1,000 years later.
1,000 years later.
Now, for me, I'm not as attached to calendar as you are,
Right.
but for me, this 1,000 years, and I do not see in Christian literature and speaking about new millennia, but I do see that the establishment of the state of Israel and collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 are
Right.
crucial elements in our current history that pushed many Christians, many more Christians, toward what I would call not necessarily philo-Semitism, but philo-Israelism.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Oh, I see. Oh, all right. So, all right. I think it helps to back up just a little bit. I was saying earlier that supersessionism means that the person who believes that he superseded his predecessors, in all cases superseded the Jews, who are the original predecessors, needs to have the Jews humiliated, disgraced, down in order to feel up and therefore good and right. Now, what happened, starting with the millennial movements in England around the what's called the English Civil War, but it's really a 20-year millennial war between the Puritans and the Royalists.
You're talking
Uh,
about 17th century.
yeah, 1640 to 1660. That's when you first get a form of Christianity. Up until that point, with almost no exceptions, any Christian who preached that the end of the world was at hand would see Jewish messianic movements, like an effort to go back to Israel as in 1240, as the work of the Antichrist. In other words, whenever they were in apocalyptic time, whatever the Jews did, they were working with Antichrist. And that's built into, for instance, Adso's Life of the Antichrist that he wrote around 950. Now, starting in the middle of the 17th century, you begin to get Christians who are able to view Jewish messianic activity as positive. That is, going back to the land, or in the case with Cromwell, he was convinced that first the Jews had to spread to all the lands of the world, and so he had to invite them back to England so that they could be at the far ends of the world, and then they could go back to Israel. And then when they went back to Israel, Jesus would come back. And that, in other words, Christian messianic success, let's call it Zionism, is a prelude, a necessary prelude to the arrival, the return of Jesus. Now, that has two problems with it. One is when Jesus returns, then the Jews are expected either to convert or they're going to get killed in the Battle of Armageddon, which is up here in the Galilee. Um, the other problem is that when Jesus doesn't return, there is a tendency to scapegoat the Jews and say it's because you didn't convert that Jesus didn't return, and therefore we're going to punish you or we're going to force you to convert. So both of those dangers are inherent in the Protestant scenario. What I want to emphasize is that just the fact that for a period of time they could view Jewish success favorably necessitated, I would say, a kind of emotional generosity that you don't see in the earlier periods. And that generosity can, and I think in the case of democracies and civil societies, did lead to a very different set of relations between Jews and Christians. What's going to happen now is interesting because, you'll excuse me, I don't believe that the Jewish Messiah is coming, and I don't believe that Jesus is coming back. And I don't believe that the Mahdi is coming. Although I do believe there are people not only who will believe it, but whose behavior will be very consequential when enough of them do believe it. And I think today we live in a time where Muslims are very much drawn to an ideology that says we live in the last generation before the installation of the global caliphate. And it's our job to bring that on, no matter how much violence Well, for some, no matter how much violence is necessary. So, what happens when Jesus doesn't come? And I wrote something in the 1990s as I was working on this problem. I wrote a paper called "What Happens When Jesus Doesn't Come" in 2000, because there were a lot of Christians, a lot of fundamentalists who were pro-Israel, who were very eager to see Jesus come back and talked about the rapture and believed that 2000 was when he would come back. And so I wrote a paper, what will happen if he doesn't. And I suggested that, we might be in for another round of anti-Semitism. Now, it turned out no, for the Christians, but it didn't turn out no for the progressives. In
Mhm.
fact, we were in for a new round of another, but in this case, new round of progressive anti-Semitism in disappointment over the failure of Oslo, which was, in my read, a sort of soft messianic project. It was, we're gonna put an end to the world's central and worst and longest lived strife, and there will be peace on earth. And Oslo failed, and the progressives blamed us. Now, I do think that if Barak had gotten a yes out of Arafat, which in my mind he couldn't have, but okay, people believed he could, if he had gotten a yes from Arafat and a secular Israeli government had handed over the Temple Mount to the control of the Muslims, then you might have had the evangelicals turn against Israel. But instead, he said no. Evangelicals stayed on our side when the war broke out, and it was the progressives who turned against us.
I have to say, Richard, that if that would have happened, I would have turned against Israel. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I understand. And at least in my analysis, if that had happened, we would have had a war anyway. In other words, my
So,
read is that the more concessions you make to the Palestinians, the more likely they are to go to war.
so now, given that you do not believe in Mashiach coming, you know,
Right.
I do not know. You see, and for me,
Well, I
my
gotta say I don't know either, but I'm not working on that
assumption,
possibility.
we
Right.
my only problem with Mashiach coming is, what am I going to do then? What
Yeah, you know the joke?
what is that?
The husband comes home to his wife and she says, "Honey, Mashiach has come." And he says, "Oh no, I just got a raise."
What, what's the point of living then?
Right.
It's like with these Muslims, yeah, we're gonna kill Jews, and if in process we die, we end up with 72 virgins.
Yeah.
Question: what are you gonna do with them?
Do with what?
With these virgins?
Oh, with the virgins, right?
It's the same thing with
Well,
Mashiach. Everything is gonna be given, food,
right.
everything is fine. No need to work, or there is a need to work. But if there is a
Well, it
need to work,
depends. It depends. I mean, if you use what I think is the most amazing and powerful and influential messianic vision, the one in Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, you're still working. You've turned the tools of dominion and you've turned the weapons of dominion into the tools of productive labor. But it's man's job to be productive.
so we're talking about not Moshiach coming, but we're talking about messianic times coming.
Exactly. Messianic
Yeah,
times.
I
Right.
agree with you, and I agree with the vision and desire of Isaiah,
Right.
and being Jerusalem and Temple Mount being the place of worship of all people of the world.
Right. And that was the UN's ideal too. I mean, they have an Isaiah Square with that passage carved into the wall. And now they've turned against Israel.
Yeah, now it's a sick humanity manifest, United
Yeah.
Nations.
Yeah.
In any case, Richard, so returning back to Catholic Church that I mentioned. I do
Right.
not know if you followed, but several days ago,
Yeah, I did. I tweeted it.
huh?
I tweeted it. It's one of my more viral tweets, yes, in which I said, it's hard to be a sane Catholic and not be deeply embarrassed.
Well, it's not simply embarrassed. It's not simply what he did with coffee, child there.
Right.
A month ago, some guy writing a book, quoted him, and I think in the letter that he sent to all Christians in Middle East, he was talking about with reference to John, I think 8 or whatever it is, and where Jesus calls his opponents the offsprings of Satan,
Yeah.
and that is Pope. And in the letter, the way he did it, he did not imply just enemies of Jesus at that time. He
Right.
meant Jews today.
Right.
So
Yeah.
my,
No.
huh?
Right.
So my question is, what does it mean in terms of attitude on the part of Christians, specifically in the United States? Because I do not see any other place of support for Israel today other than the United States and Christians of older age.
All right. So let me first point out to some other places of support. I believe that there's a lot of support for Israel and Iran. And if the mullahs fall, which I sincerely hope happens soon, we may have an Iranian regime which is on our side. I believe the
Well, that
Kurds.
that that is a great thing. I'm not sure, but I hope that you are right.
Right. I believe the Kurds view us quite favorably. The Druze, at least many of them, view us favorably. Look, the Middle East is in the equivalent of the 30 Years' War of the 17th century. It may last more than 30 years, but basically it's a war of sects in which whenever somebody gets power, they monopolize power. This is what triumphalist religiosity is about. And I think we're probably going to see that in Syria.
And you
So
believe that the
far,
support, I understand and I agree with you, but
right,
just because there's going to be a change of system of government, hopefully in Iran, although I'm not sure, although I believe there's a strong possibility under certain
right,
circumstances. Uh, Israel is basically, it showed itself powerful, but it's still a tiny country
right.
a few million people, surrounded by hundreds of millions potential
Right.
enemies,
A statistical error.
statistical areas. And so it requires support of major power in the world. And the only
Right.
major power in the world today that supports it in the United States.
Okay, so the next thing I was going to get to was I do think that we have friends and admirers in Europe, and that up until now, for the last 25 years, basically democracies have been tongue-tied about the threat of Islam. They won't talk about it. If you do talk about it, you're accused of racism and Islamophobia, and you're shut out of the conversation. I think that's beginning to fall apart because it's impossible to ignore just how far Islam has gone and how aggressive it is, which, everybody witnessed on October 7th. Now, that can lead either to people saying, they're too strong, I will adopt the status of a dhimmi, so I'll make them and their triumphalism happy, and I'll
Mhm.
survive in some way or other, or to fight back. And I think it's possible that we're going to see Europeans fighting back. And when they start to fight back, they will realize almost immediately that we've been fighting their fight up until now, and that instead of helping us, they've been dragging us down.
Yeah,
So I
but
do think,
that is convenient alliance for Israel. I'm talking about the fundamental support. I mean, in the United States, the evangelicals, the way I see it, many have
right,
ideological, fundamental support for Israel. I do not know if I like, as you pointed, uh, their final realization of this
right,
thing.
their final scenario, the end of their apocalyptic scenario. Yes,
Right. I mean, I don't.
right.
And
I know.
but they're fundamentally, very supportive. It's evangelical, some Mormons, also in that way. Um, but in Europe, among Christians, I do not see any fundamental support for Jews and for Israel. I mean,
Yeah.
politically, people in Europe are going to be galvanized, as you said, against Muslims. But I do not know if ultimately it's that good of a thing. I mean, Reconquista, in Spain, also in the beginning needed Jewish help, in fight against Muslims.
So, yeah. Um, let's talk about American
Yeah.
Christians.
Okay.
Now, I don't know the latest things, but I think you're right in emphasizing that it's the older generation that is sort of dyed-in-the-wool pro-Israel, Christian Zionist, and that the younger generation is under the kinds of pressures that everybody's under to side with the Palestinians, including, just the massive amount of social media and legacy media repetition and presentation of Palestinian war propaganda as news that, Israel deliberately targets babies and snipers shoot babies in the head and so on. We know that this is what the Palestinians did during the Intifada. And the people who actually target civilians and children and snipers who shoot babies in the head and people who celebrate it in the streets, you're going to believe them that Israel is doing that? You're going to believe the people who do the thing that when they accuse their enemies of doing it? Well, apparently, yes. And the news media is playing a terrible role in the sort of forwarding of this propaganda
Why
projection.
do you think it is? I mean, in your book, lethal journalism.
Journalism. Yeah,
Why do you
yeah.
think it is? I mean, are they stupid? And by the way, the nominal Jews among them play a very important role.
Yeah. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. So what I would say, look, I think there are three reasons why,
Hmm.
and they all overlap. It's not any single reason. One reason is just pure intimidation. Any journalist who works here and who does not basically make Israel the bad guy and the Palestinians the victim is not only not going to get anywhere, have no access in the amongst Palestinian figures, but if they go to Palestinian territory, they are in danger. No Israeli is even allowed to, no Israeli journalist is allowed in Gaza because
Except Amir Khas and Levy.
yes, okay. So, the
Palestinians
people
love
who are
them.
already on their side, right. So, yeah, so I mean, I remember at one point they kidnapped this British journalist, and people, the Brits, the BBC said, why did they kidnap him? He was on their side, which means that, they assume that the kidnapping is to intimidate, and if you are towing their line, they'll leave you alone. So one level of this is just pure intimidation, and that is definitely related to the material that comes from the conflict. The second reason, I think, is this kind of supersessionism, this moral schadenfreude, this pleasure that they take in the moral degradation of the Jewish state. And then the last is, I think, some of them I think are completely convinced by the post-colonial paradigm in which we're the imperialist colonialists and the Palestinians are the indigenous people. Now you can say, okay, but that takes a sort of level of either stupidity or ignorance, which, shows some level of willpower to accomplish. Um, so I'm willing to grant you that, say, maybe 20% of the journalists really believe this post-colonial paradigm, really believe that we are imperialist occupiers and that these poor indigenous people, if they were left alone, would be free. And that's what this chant, Free Palestine, is about. I mean, there's no bigger joke than Free Palestine, meaning let Hamas take over. You know, if you know what's going on in Hamas prisons or in PA prisons, you know that the political culture of the Palestinians has never shown the slightest tendency towards the human rights and the freedoms even of their own people, much less of religious and other forms of minorities and even gender in terms of women. So, so there are some people I think who are ideologically committed to this. But I think the poisonous combination is on the one hand, fear of retaliation from the Muslims if you don't adopt what I call the jihadi narrative for infidels. So the jihadi narrative for infidels is Palestinians are fighting for liberation, Jews are terrible oppressors, the Jews are trying to ethnically cleanse and commit Jewish genocide. The Palestinians are in favor of human rights and freedom. Um, that towing that line is
I would have agreed with you, but
uh,
I am not going to agree with you on this one.
okay. I like
Why?
that.
Uh, uh, it's um, it's not simply that the journalists are afraid. I mean, fear, especially those that do travel there, could be an element. But even
Okay.
then, some people travel and they find the way to talk to those people and be there and collect information, even they don't agree with Palestinians or other
Sure.
Arabs. For me, I think the biggest reason for support of Palestinians among the journalists is the general vacuum, ideological vacuum after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Marxism, of socialism. The left,
Right.
the so called progressive left, they want
Right.
progress, whatever it is.
Right.
The only thing they can have, is black racism, and some other form of racism, as identity, but nothing that would tell them, yes, history is on our side. We are moving along the right way of history or doing something. The Marxism collapse. In one of your articles, I think, or maybe books, you mentioned a guy by the name of Wilhelm Reich.
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 Wilhelm Reich.
A crazy guy, I have to say. I'm sorry. But
Yeah.
huh?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you said that he was probably the only one on the left in Germany who properly identify the sources of Nazism, of
Uh-huh.
fascism in Germany.
Hmm. I
You
don't remember saying that, but okay.
you mentioned him specifically, and that's why I looked at it because I never
Right.
heard that name before, and then he is a guy who stands out in many
Right.
in many
With his
ways.
orgone box.
What is that?
With his orgone box.
Yes, that
Yeah.
is true. Could not understand, but then just a little bit learning. Thank you for mentioning it. But the thing is, his main thought was that the social democrats in Germany, many of supporters of social democracy, went to Nazis, to fascists, or as he calls there, uh, because not so much only because of what Nazis were offering, but what Nazis were offering to the masses, that is, masses. Not simply somebody gave something to somebody, but offering masses, a large number of German simple
Right.
folks, a new view of the world and of themselves.
Uh-huh.
And I think this anti Semitism, and I cannot call it anything else, because they say, well, no, it's anti Israelism. We're against Israel, we're against Zionists. Um,
Right.
yeah, we're against Zionists. I do not know how can any Christian say that he is anti-Zionist when his own Bible that he accepts says that it's from Zion all the laws will come.
teachings.
Teaching laws and teaching, depending how you
Kitetz
yeah.
Torah, the
But
Torah, the
what is, yeah,
teachings of the Torah, including
right.
the laws.
But the thing is that for leftists, when I feel sorry for them. They have no
Yeah,
ideology. They have nothing, nothing. They used to have Marxism, but it's just broken up.
right, right. So I just attended a talk by Douglas Murray, and he said precisely the same thing. He said, you're looking at people who have no meaning in their lives, they have no direction, and they are looking for it, and they follow the strong hand.
Yeah.
So along comes somebody saying, I have meaning. I would add that there's a real thrill to sticking it to Jews. I mean, accuse the Russians of genocide and they'll look at you and say, go to hell. You accuse the Jews of genocide and you get this sadistic thrill of seeing them in pain, saying, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not trying. I'm so sorry. I wish I didn't have to kill innocent civilians, which is true. But there's this enjoyment of being able to say, oh, you Jews, 2000 years you were oppressed, and now as soon as you have power, you turn around and do it to somebody else. Well, if anybody will turn around and do it to somebody else in a blink of an eye when they get power, it's the Palestinians. And yet here are all these people looking at us who have gone for 75 years without turning on either ourselves, the way the Chinese and the Russians and the French revolutionaries did, nor turning on our really despicable neighbors. I mean, they behave abominably. Here we are, 75 years into the not doing this, and people just trip over themselves to accuse us of no sooner do we get power than we turn on others. So there's a kind of, yummy taste to that accusation that only works with the Jews. It doesn't work
But
with
Richard, the same people were accusing us of all kinds of murderous sins in 1905 when
right,
they were
right.
killing 3,000 of us.
Okay. No, but I don't think it's the same people. In other words, the progressives who are doing it today do not see themselves. You may want to argue, and psychologically, there's
Mm.
certainly ways you could argue that they are in fact carrying forward in a different idiom the same animosities and the same uh, revenge agendas on the Jews for making them look bad in their own eyes. But I do think that progressives today certainly do not identify the pogromists, the you know the Cossacks as their sort of intellectual and moral origins. The
Why?
fact
They identify themselves with Hamas, who did the same.
Right. Okay, so yes, so we end up coming around, we end up coming full circle. And I think that the supersessionist argument is the best to understand how this keeps coming up, that somehow people who have internalized Jewish ethics, Jewish attitudes towards being humane, giving other people the benefit of the doubt, positive sum relations, all of the kinds of things that are embedded in the biblical text, not enjoying Schadenfreude and not rejoicing over your enemy's downfall and so on. All of these things, people who have adopted them somehow have this need to feel superior to us. And, until they
I have
stop,
no problem with them feeling superior to me as long as they don't try to kill me.
well, as long as they need, in order to feel superior, I mean, this is one of the problems with the need to feel superior, is that, you need proof of your
To see
superiority.
me
And the
suffer,
proof,
yeah?
yeah, the proof is in your superiority. So in medieval times, when society was stratified, the Christians would be over the Jews. Now, some Jews would rise up, but by and large, their status was always delicate. You know, one of the most successful Jews in medieval Europe was Barbanel, who was the financial advisor of the King of Spain. But when it came time to kick him out, that was it. He left, and he left his fortune. So um, it's the need to feel, the need to have visible proof that you are superior. And if you don't have that visible proof, you lose faith in your faith. You go into an identity crisis. And essentially that's what's happened to Islam in the modern world. You know, throughout the Middle Ages, Islam and Christianity were sort of worthy adversaries. Neither was totally superior, someone here, someone there, back and forth, up and down. Starting with modernity, the West became vastly more powerful, more influential than the Muslim world, and the Muslims went through a real crisis. The best book on this is Bernard Lewis,
Mhm.
What Went Wrong? And they're still trying to recover from it. And the one thing they won't try is to adopt Western rules. So they're still trying to win by medieval rules of conquest.
Richard,
And
Richard, we dealt a little bit, you know, with Christian and secular successionism,
right,
not so much with Muslims. But
right,
my question, I have a question. I mean, Surah in Quran, Surah I think 5:21, whatever it is,
okay,
clearly states that the promised land was given to people of Moses,
right.
very clearly. So now this is in Quran. So Muslims cannot say that Jews screwed it up and wrote something and put it differently. It's in Quran.
Right.
So, and another question I have to the same
So but
Muslims.
wait, before you get to that question, let me just say this.
Yeah.
Muslims have a doctrine of, I forget exactly the term for it, but it means that later surahs cancel out earlier surahs. So you have some earlier surahs which are in favor of tolerance, and they're canceled out by later surahs that are jihadi surahs. And the same thing here. There are
So
surahs
this
in
surah
the
has
Quran that
been
are
canceled,
favorable to Jews, there are surahs in the Quran that are favorable to Jews, but there are also surahs in the Quran that say because the Jews didn't observe the laws that God gave them properly, they deserve to be beaten down,
but there
if
is
that
one question that I'd like Muslims to answer. I'd like to invite some Muslims, you know, to answer
right.
this question. Why
Okay.
did Abraham send Agar and Ishmael away from the promised land?
Yeah. Well, good luck with asking them that. But to be honest, you know, according to, and I've never quite been able to penetrate the tradition, but I understand that in their tradition, Abraham bound Ishmael down, not Isaac down,
I understand. I mean, they don't name him. If
which
they
is
would be
weird. I mean,
so,
it's like victim envy.
yes, it's victim, but they do not call, you know, son to be
Right,
Ishmael. They just say son. But
right.
my question is, why did Abraham did not keep him in the promised land, in the land of Canaan? Why did he send Agar and the Ishmael away?
You're going by the biblical account.
Oh,
It's not the Quranic account.
I understand, but they
Right. So they
accept the
would say,
idea because in Quran there's also that Abraham visited them in on the road to Mecca.
right.
So it was not already promised land, but Isaac was kept in the promised land. So what I'm saying is this: the Muslims lie to themselves. We all lie to ourselves. I mean, it's not only Muslims, but we all lie to ourselves. But Muslims, in this particular case, when they say that they're people, you know, that comply with will of God and follow Abraham, they should ask themselves a question. Maybe
Yeah. So I think one of the things that will help understand this is, for you, you read this passage and you say, oh, wow, this and this and all these passages argue that Muslims should be welcome Jews back to the land. All right. And to some extent, that's what happened in the 17th and 18th and 19th
I'm
century in
sorry, what did you
Christianity.
say? I read this passage and I say Muslims should be.
Yeah, Muslims, these are Muslim passages, they should welcome the Jews back into the land.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
No?
No. What I'm saying is that they should get out from that land, follow the will of Abraham, who sent away Agar and
Right, and leave us
Ishmael,
alone.
so he would not compete for that land with the
Right.
prodigy
So
following
they
Isaac.
so they would leave us alone in our land.
Right.
Yes, okay. So I'm saying
Not accept us.
for
We don't
you,
need their acceptance.
I understand. But for you,
Mm.
reading these passages seems to be a good argument for them giving us this land and leaving us alone. And I'm all
Or at
for that.
least stop exploding themselves and
Right,
us in the
right,
process.
right. And I'm all for that. But the what's happened to Islam, and particularly to the people I call the caliphators, that's the Muslims who are working for a global caliphate in our day. What's happened to them is that the existence of an autonomous infidel entity in Dar al-Islam, and a fortiori a Jewish infidel autonomous entity, is an insult to their pride.
Mm.
It's an insult to their honor. And
Intolerable,
this is a
intolerable
war about
insult.
lost honor.
Yeah. Intolerable insult.
Intolerable. It's an intolerable insult.
Yeah.
And and nobody in the West wants to say to them, grow up, because that would sound condescending. So they continue to behave like, the French term is enfant terrible, the sort of child who throws fits and conniptions and terrorizes his parents. So they do that, and we allow them to do it. We're terrified of them.
Richard, this is a terribly depressing conclusion to our conversation, to our interview. Uh, I hope that maybe we get a chance to talk again because
All right.
I have to say I am very, very interested in your medieval,
Right.
work and in your work, in many other areas. So I hope that we'll talk again about
All
others.
right.
And hopefully
Good.
it's going to be more promising. Maybe Moshiach is going to be there too. Already, not I don't believe in Moshiach, but some other thing. Uh, and I want to thank you. Huh?
Right. Let me finish with a
Please
messianic joke.
go ahead.
All right. So, the Jerusalem Zoo has an exhibit, the messianic exhibit, and above it is inscribed, "The lion will lie down with the lamb," and they have a lion and a lamb lying down together. And so, one of the visitors is astonished at this. He goes to the zookeeper, says, "How do you do it?" And he says, "Oh, it's easy. New lamb every day."
Well, there could be a different conclusion saying, well, yeah, he's lying with the lamb because he just, to his satisfaction, ate his mother.
Oh, all right.
Something like this.
Okay. All
In
right.
any case, but I do believe in. I'm not as observant as you are. I am just a Jew of one mitzvah, but I do believe in the prophecy of Isaiah. Not because it will come tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I do not know. I'm not a prophet, but I
Right.
do believe it in it as a guiding light for my attitude toward the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that millennialism, the belief in a coming messianic age, has played an enormous role in improving the world. So I'm not opposed to the belief. I just don't almost, it would be so much better if we could do this on our own and not have some supernatural intervention that
You
brings
just
it.
do not want to join some gang.
Yeah.
in any case, Richard, thank you very much for stopping by. And as I said, I hope we talk again. And
All
I
right.
wish you
Looking forward.
the very, very best.
All right.